Hello. Hello, guys. Apologies. I'm back and I am here to answer some questions. Apologies. I'm going to be looking down at my phone as I'm unable to see the conversations as they go live at the moment. So, first question that I has been put out is what other things what other things preschools need to do? So preschools will be operating in a very similar way and manner to primary schools in that they may well be doing staggered start and finish times. And the guidelines for preschools are pretty much the same as that of primary schools. So there isn't anything different per se that they will be doing. So that's that question. But again, so there isn't anything different, but they will be putting measures in place to really limit the flow of children and even adults. So, for example, where you might have been able to go into a nursery to see your child off and drop them off, there may be a request that now children are dropped out. Parents don't go any further than outside of the building. So these are the kind of measures, for examples, that preschools will be considering. But again, they're very similar to what a primary school would be considering also. Another question. Are there any rules that all preschools and schools need to be following? So there aren't rules per se, and there are more guidelines. But one of the things to recognize is that all schools, preschools included, will be trying to keep their children as safe as possible. So guidelines are being followed, and many schools have been in contact with the public health team in Tower Hamlets to kind of understand how to best interpret the guidelines and to consider the uniqueness of every school. So, for example, some schools are going to be multi-form entry schools. So, i.e., for example, in year seven, there may be three classes versus another secondary school which may have five or six classes. So it's a lot bigger. So again, they've been in contact with public health and we're supporting schools so that they can better understand guidelines and also look at what are the best ways to interpret and put those guidelines into practice within the school environment. Um, are children going back in small groups or the whole class? So again, this is a question that I could say I can't really answer generally because each school will be taking a slightly different approach. All schools will be operating in some form of bubble or another. So it may well be that the entire class is going back, but then that class then forms a bubble. And a bubble essentially means a group of children who will be playing together, they will be having lunch together and spending most of their time together. And the point or the purpose of operating within these bubbles is purely because if there then happens to be a positive case within a school, it's easier to isolate people who, or the other students who would have been in close contact with the child who was tested positive. Apologies, I'm going to keep looking down, but I am here. Um, why school attendance not optional as we're heading for an increase in numbers? I'm not sure I totally understand that question, but I guess again, it's part of what I said in my introduction, which is essentially that we recognize that being at school is really, really important for children. It's the best place for children to learn, and it's not just solely about education and learning and their educational attainment, but it's also really, really important for children's mental well-being and their physical well-being as well. So we know that when children are at school, they are able to be active. And for many children, not coming to school really limits their physical activity levels. And that's really, really important for us in public health and just generally for the health of the child. Um, so I have another question here that says, do I need to send my 4-year-old to preschool if I have a vulnerable child at home? Now, again, the answer to this question, I guess, is not very simple. So my advice would be in this instance would be to speak to the professional, the healthcare professional who looks after the vulnerable child, because it really depends on what that vulnerability is as to whether or not their sibling should or could be going to schools, and also to recognize that for children who can't go to school, so for example children who are themselves vulnerable, schools should be and are doing a lot of work to support those children at home as they continue to learn. So it's just to recognize the fact that whilst the vast majority of children are being encouraged back to school in September, there will be a small cohort of children who aren't coming back to school in September, and schools will be supporting those children to make sure that they are remain engaged with school, and just to really keep them linked in. Again, apologies, I'm going to keep looking down at my phone. How do bubbles work? So I might have mentioned before, but I'll just say it again. But bubbles essentially are a group of children grouped together that will kind of play together and do most of their activities together. So they will learn together, potentially do PE together, and certainly have lunch in these groups. And the idea behind bubbles is really to limit the number of children who are coming in contact with one another. So it's recognized that as the whole school are being encouraged to go back in September, that bubbles might be slightly larger, and a bubble might actually consist of a whole entire class. But in doing so, what that does is it ensures that actually we can limit the number of children that are coming into contact with one another. So those bubbles, for example, may just have one teacher and not have multiple teachers in the same ways that they did previously. And I'm just looking down at any questions, so apologies if I keep looking away. Apologies guys for all the pauses. Just checking to see if we have any more questions coming through. But again, as I've mentioned before, please do feel free to leave comments at the end of this video. What we hope to do is to continue to answer these questions and also run a similar session to this live session without so many IT hiccups next week. So again, if you do have any more questions and you weren't able to put them within this session, please feel free to do so again next week. So one of the questions that we have is, why is it so important for children to go back to school as it's a risk to their health? So again, I mentioned at the beginning that children do have a right to education, and the best place for them to get that education and the best place for a child to learn is at school. The impacts of being away from school have longer term impacts than just on their education. It has impacts on their emotional well-being as well as their social impacts, so their just ability to interact with other children. So there are a number of benefits to actually allowing children to go back to school, and they're wider than just your educational impacts. It's actually really, really important for children to be back at school, socializing, making friends, because that has an impact on their mental well-being. And in addition to which, being back at school also encourages children to be physically active, which again is very, very important. Also, another thing to recognize is that children thus far have played a really, really small part in the spread of coronavirus. So actually, there isn't a lot of evidence to suggest that going back to school is going to be very, very unsafe for children themselves. So that's in large, that's the reason why we are really encouraging children to go back to school in September. Again, apologies, I'm reading from my phone. What if we have different after-school bubbles? I'm not entirely sure that I understand that question. So whoever did put that question in the group, if you could explain a bit further what it is that you mean by after-school bubbles, I'll be more than happy to take that question. I believe there's another question that's around bubbles in schools again. So the question says, is that safe? So one of the things that we recognize is that bubbles are the best way for us to be able to limit the spread of coronavirus if someone tests positive within that environment. Because what it does mean is that if a child does test positive, we can ask the children within that bubble, if they're a close contact, to then self-isolate. If we operated without any bubbles within the school environment, the risk that we have is that if someone then tests positive, the entire school potentially then needs to self-isolate for 14 days. And that would be quite difficult. And equally, it also means that whilst someone may not have tested positive, but they have symptoms of COVID-19, we'd still be asking the entire school to self-isolate because we wouldn't know what their results were until these results were back. So that's why within the school environment, within preschool environments, and even nurseries, that we're operating within bubbles. Again, apologies as I keep looking down at my phone. So we don't have any more questions at the moment. But again, I really do want to encourage you all to put your questions in the chat function of the box. And if they aren't answered this week in this session, then definitely within next week's session, they will be answered. And also one of the really useful things to putting your questions in the chat is it also helps us to tailor the next session a bit better. So we understand what it is that people want to know, what's useful for people to know. So from today's conversations, for example, I can see that a lot of you have questions around bubbles and how this works. So next week, what I will start by doing is talking a bit more about bubbles and the concept behind bubbles and why they're so important. I'm not sure if we've got any more questions coming through. I'll just give it a few more moments for any questions. I'm not sure if we have any more questions, but I did want to say thank you all for coming today. Thank you for your questions. Again, if you do have any more questions, please feel free to leave it in the chat function of this message. Thank you.